When he returned from his tour of Wigan and the depressed areas of the north in May 1936, Orwell moved to the quiet village of Wallington in Hertfordshire. With an advance from his publisher, he settled down to try and write. On the 9th of June, he married Eileen O'Shaughnessy in the village church.
Eric Arthur Blair, bachelor of this parish. Eileen Maud O'Shaughnessy, spinster, parish of Greenwich. She walked up the road and he walked up the bridleway or the footpath and leapt over the wall and joined her in the porch.
She was very pretty, very intelligent, very philosophical, awfully good company. You know,
He talked to you about that?
Yes, he was very, very angry. A friend of mine.
Was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I'd ever been in a town where the working class boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shopwalkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Everyone called everyone else comrade and thou, and said salud. I saw, in fact, history being written not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened according to various party lines. This kind of thing is frightening to me, because it often gives me the feeling that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. After all, the chances are that those lies, or at any rate similar lies, will pass into history. How will the history of the Spanish War be written? If Franco remains in power, his nominees will write the history books. I know it is the fashion to say that most of recorded history is lies anyway. I'm willing to believe that history is for the most part inaccurate and biased. But what is peculiar to our own age is the abandonment of the idea that history could be truthfully written.
Señor, entre favor, caballero.
Two detectives came round the train taking the names of foreigners, but when they saw us in the dining car, they seemed satisfied we were respectable. It was queer how everything had changed. Only 6 months ago, when it was looking like a proletarian that made you respectable. So, and after just 6 months, I was on French soil again. And then England, southern England, probably the sleekest landscape in the world. It is difficult when you pass that way, especially when you are peacefully recovering from seasickness with the plush cushions of a boat train carriage underneath your bum, to believe that anything is really happening anywhere. Earthquakes in Japan, famines in China, revolutions in Mexico. Don't worry, the milk will be on the doorstep tomorrow morning. The New Statesman will come out on Friday. The industrial towns were far away. And meditate. Slow-moving streams bordered by willows, the green bosoms of the elms, the larkspurs in the cottage gardens, and then the huge, peaceful wilderness of outer London. The barges on the miry river, the familiar streets, the posters telling of cricket matches and royal weddings, the men in bowler hats, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses, the blue from which I sometimes fear we shall never wake till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs.
Seid ihr entschlossen, dem Führer in der Erkämpfung des Sieges durch die persönlichen Belastungen zu folgen?
For Orwell, after his experience in the Spanish Civil War, totalitarianism had become the enemy. He saw the coming war in Europe as a conflict between two distorted ideologies, Nazi fascism and Stalinist communism. When Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, Orwell's profound suspicions of a Russian style of communism were confirmed.
The work of teaching and organising the others fell naturally upon the pigs, who were generally recognised as being the cleverest of the animals. Preeminent among the pigs were two young boars, named Snowball and Napoleon, who Mr. Jones was breeding up for sale. Napoleon was a large, rather fierce-looking Berkshire boar. Not much of a talker, but with a reputation for getting his own way. Snowball was a more vivacious pig than Napoleon, quicker in speech and more inventive, but was not considered to have the same depth of character.
Our animal farm, I thought, was quite amusing, but of course it's been done before. I mean, Swift did it, Anatole France did it in Penguin Island, Aristophanes did it long ago. You know, it's been done quite a lot before, so it wasn't all that original as people acclaimed it.
Moscow, capital of Soviet Russia, is the scene of another dramatic trial in which world interest is being taken. It is alleged that Trotsky, the unseen prisoner in the dock, at present living in Norway, is the mastermind behind a great plot to smash up the Soviet regime by methods of terrorism. And at least one witness has declared that it was proposed to assassinate Stalin during this year's May Day parade.
There should be a full investigation into Snowball's activities. He set out and made a careful tour of the section of the farm buildings, the other animals following at a respectful distance. At every few steps, Napoleon stopped and snuffed the ground for traces of Snowball's footsteps, which he said he could detect by the smell. He would put his snout to the ground, give several deep sniffs, and exclaim in a terrible voice, "Snowball, he has been here. I can smell him distinctly." The animals were thoroughly frightened.
Some 14 men are on trial for their lives. There are two chief accused. One is Kamenev, who worked in close association with Lenin in 1917.
The four pigs waited, trembling, with guilt written on every line of their countenances. Napoleon now called upon them to confess their crimes. Without any further prompting, they confessed they'd been secretly in touch with Snowball ever since his expulsion, that they had collaborated with him in destroying the windmill, and that they'd entered into an agreement with him to hand over Animal Farm to Mr. Frederick. When they'd finished their confession, the dogs promptly tore their throats out, and in a terrible voice, Napoleon demanded whether any other animal had anything to confess.
He and I probably got on rather well. At the time, we were both premature anti-Stalinists. It's difficult to convey now how much Uncle Joe Stalin, was thought to be a good thing once the Russians had entered the war in 1941. And this, I think, played a part in hardening Orwell's feelings against communism.
I'm very, very glad to have met you. Very glad indeed. Благодарим вас за помощь, которую оказали вы нам в войне против гитлеровской Германии.
We shall have one debt after this war which we shall not forget and which we shall pay in full. And that is our debt of gratitude to the men of the Red Army and those who are behind us. To our comrades, our grand salute to the men of the Red Army.
I think he basically proceeded from the quite opposite view that people were much too much conned by the Soviet war effort into taking a favourable view of the government of the Soviet Union. This was, of course, the reason for writing Animal Farm at that time, a little squib, as he says, in a letter to somebody. And he didn't at that period take it as being important. I mean, it is, I think, a very important book.
Napoleon himself was not seen in public as often as once a fortnight. When he did appear, he was attended not only by his retinue of dogs, but by a black cockerel who marched in front of him and acted as a kind of trumpeter, letting out a loud cock-a-doodle-doo before Napoleon spoke. Even in the farmhouse, it was said, Napoleon inhabited separate apartments from the others. He took his meals alone with two dogs to wait upon him, and always ate from the Crown Derby dinner service, which had been in the glass cupboard in the drawing room. Napoleon was now never spoken of simply as Napoleon. He was always referred to, in formal style, as our leader, Comrade Napoleon. And the pigs liked to invent for him such titles as Father of all animals, Terror of mankind, Protector of the sheepfold, Duckling's friend, and the like. In his speeches, Squealer would talk with the tears rolling down his cheeks of Napoleon's wisdom, the goodness of his heart, and the deep love he bore to all animals everywhere. Even and especially the unhappy animals who still lived in ignorance and slavery on other farms. You'd often hear one hen remark to another, "Under the guidance of our leader, Comrade Napoleon, I have laid 5 eggs in 6 days." Or 2 cows enjoying a drink at the pool would exclaim, "Thanks to the leadership of Comrade Napoleon, how excellent this water tastes."
Orwell was denied any pleasure from the victory celebrations at the end of World War II. He and his wife Eileen had adopted a baby boy, Richard, but Orwell was separated from them, working as a war correspondent, when she was suddenly taken into hospital for what appeared to be a routine operation.
She went up to the north after she left the ministry with the baby and died there. And he was in Paris.
How was it that Eileen died? Because some people have said she had cancer.
I don't think she can have. So we didn't know that there was anything wrong with her when she went off. And she'd only been up there for 2 or 3 months.
Dearest, I'm just going to have the operation, already enemaed, injected, with morphia in the right arm, which is a nuisance. Cleaned and packed up like a precious image. The writing degenerating. And those were the last words she wrote, because she died under the anaesthetic not long afterwards.
As an archivist, do things like that touch you?
Yes, this one still moves me, though I've read it many times. I find it very sad. But there's very little of that sort of material in Orwell's papers, as they've survived with us. There aren't all the papers you would expect there to be of somebody's private papers, because I think probably he moved house so often that a lot of his papers are cleared out. But everything we're left with, we're keeping, because there is so little that gives us a clue to Orwell, the personal man.
I remember during the war, near the end of the war, going out to one of our weekly lunches when he said to me how much he hated London and how much he'd like to get out of it. But he said, of course, you can't get out, or you can't leave when people are being bombed to bits all around you. He didn't say this in the least heroically. I would have been most happy to get out if I could have done. His behaviour was sometimes absurd in what I found an endearing way, like at our lunches, there would always be on the menu perhaps some really quite good bit of food, like, say, liver and bacon. Orwell would never have that. What he would go for would be, as again you might say, and I think it is really true, the victory pie, which was practically uneatable, and he would eat it quite zestfully and say with, in a rather happy way, you won't get anything better than this nowadays. So this image of his being somebody who liked something in that.
He'd come back about 2 and work till about 6, where we had a high tea. And that was very nice. And he loved kippers, Yarmouth kippers, great big shiny fresh ones. And he said he liked them because it was easy to put them in a jug of boiling water and they'd cook themselves. However, I fried mine. And he liked scones and gentleman's relish and homemade jam.
He meditated on the physical texture of life. Had it always been like this? Had food always tasted like this? He looked round the canteen, a low-ceilinged, crowded room, its walls grimy from the contact of innumerable bodies, battered metal tables and chairs placed so close together that you sat with elbows touching. Bent spoons, dented trays, coarse white mugs, all surfaces greasy, grime in every crack, and a sourish composite smell of bad gin and bad coffee and metallic stew and dirty clothes. Always in your stomach and in your skin there was a sort of protest, a feeling that you'd been cheated of something that you had a right to. If one's heart sickened at the discomfort of dirt and scarcity, the interminable winters, the stickiness of one's socks, the cold water, the gritty soap, the cigarettes that came to pieces, the food with its strange, evil taste. Why should one feel it to be intolerable unless one had some kind of ancestral memory that things had once been different?
A good deal of the setting of the book reflects the life that we were living in 1948, the life of shortages, of rationing. There are references, for example, to clothing coupons. The lift not working, again, is an absolute parallel for 1948, in which electricity was liable to be cut off at almost any time, and in which, of course, it was especially cut off during the very hard winter of 1946-7, when there were all sorts of government edicts telling you not to do this and not to do that.
Let us all join together now in one more great effort. This time, we showed the world what we could do during the war. Let's show it again now. Let's pull together for prosperity.
And angry, in a world of gloom and shortages, Orwell struggled on alone with his adopted son. He sought female companionship with the desperation of the very lonely. This is how he replied to a fan letter from his childhood friend Jacintha Buddicombe.
Hail and farewell, my dear Jacintha. You see, I haven't forgotten. I wrote to you yesterday, but the letter isn't posted yet, so I'll go on to cheer this dismal day. I'd like you to see Richard. He has an enormous interest in machinery, which may be useful to him later on. When I was not much more than his age, I always knew I wanted to write. But I think it's rather a good thing Richard is such an entirely practical child. Are you fond of children? I think you must be. You were such a tender-hearted girl, always full of pity for the creatures we others shot and killed. But you were not so tender-hearted to me when you abandoned me to Burma with all hope denied. We're older now, and with this wretched illness, the years will have taken more toll of me than of you. I do so want us to meet again. As we always ended, so that there should be no ending, farewell and hail, Eric.
Well, of course, that letter was in reply to mine to him, and I wrote to him after all those years because I thought that Animal Farm was such a magnificent book. I thought it was one of the best books I'd ever read, and so when I realised that it was my old friend Eric who'd written it, and who now really was, or ought to be, a famous author, as he'd always hoped to be, I wrote to congratulate him on it and to say that it was a beautiful book. And that was his reply. Well,
did it alarm you a little, the reply?
Well, he seemed to be remembering everything that had happened, and I was rather unnerved at the possibility that he might be sort of hoping to pick up where he left off, so to speak, and possibly to be having hopes of him for the future, which I didn't feel was any more plausible then than it had been, what was it, 30 years ago.
My wife and I felt rather sort of protective towards him because I somehow felt that after his wife Eileen's death, his life in London, where he was busily saying yes to all journalist commissions and writing, it somehow wasn't viable. I could see why he sort of walked out on it and went all the way to Jura.
I want to give you complete details about the journey, which isn't so formidable as it looks on paper. You have to catch the boat train at Glasgow at 8 a.m, which means that it's safer to sleep the preceding night at Glasgow. 8 a.m, leave Glasgow Central for Gourock. Join boat for Tarbert at Gourock. About 12 noon, arrive East Tarbert. Travel by bus to West Tarbert. Join boat for Craighouse at West Tarbert. 3:30 p.m. arrive Craighouse. Take hired car to Lilt, where we meet you. It's important to let us know in advance when you come, because of the want a raincoat and, if possible, stout boots or shoes, gum boots if you have them. I'm afraid I'm making all this sound very intimidating, but really it's easy enough.
Came up, of course, primarily to write, and to write one thing, to write 1984, which had been bubbling in his mind a lot earlier than I was able to show that most people had suspected. There are these notes for a perfectly clear outline of it from the winter of 42 to 43, but it isn't until 47 he's able to get down to work on it, and very specifically that's what he comes to Jura for, and on the whole keeps his nose down to 1984. He does one or two other essays for American journals, that kind of thing, but on the whole he's there to write and to be left alone. Well, that's the end of the paved road. and there's 7.5 miles of very rough and broken road down to Barnhill from the big house at Ardlussa. Well, first of all, did it on a motorbike. And he carried furniture from Ardlussa with his Canadian poet friend Paul Potts. A bit of folly, I admit, for a man, I think, knowing that he had tuberculosis then. I don't think he could have been fooling himself that it was just bronchitis any longer, to be so far away from a doctor.
Barnhill, Jura. I can work, but that is about all I can do. To walk even a few hundred yards promptly upsets me. It's annoying that after a filthy spell, we've been having nice weather, but I am on the grisly job of working on my novel. I sit at the window, study the landscape, and write.
He arrived in April 47, and I remember very vividly him coming in and how ill and terribly ill he looked, and terribly drawn and sad face he had.
It's an extraordinary place for a man in that condition to come to, isn't it? Was life much harder than it is now?
Well, much harder, because there was no telephone nearer than Craig House, which is 27 miles. There was, petrol was rationed, rationing was on, only shop was down Craig House, and our really only communication was by the post van, which came 3 times a week.
Were you very surprised when he came and settled in this wild place here?
Well, I wasn't really, because after all, he'd been living in London all during the war. You know, it was kind of strange. And he always loved the country. And here, you see, he was completely free and away from everybody. Nobody could get at him. Difficult communications altogether. And I think that was one of the reasons why he came. And it is a lovely place.
Living here must have been the most difficult operation, I should think.
Well, you have to be self-reliant and able to do things yourself, because, of course, you never could get a tradesman up to do anything if you broke a window or a pipe burst.
And I suppose any question of getting a doctor would have been tried out of the question.
Well, there was a doctor on the island, but, of course, right down at the other end, you know, and nobody was very keen to come up because the road was so bad.
Do you think that he felt that he was writing against time, as it were?
I don't think so, because I don't think that he was the sort of person who ever thought he was going to die. Not immediately, anyway.
Although he knew he was ill, of course.
He knew he was ill, but I don't think he ever entertained what is commonly known as the death wish.
Do you think that if he'd been properly looked after, or properly looked after himself, his life might have been saved?
Well, I think when you say look after himself, I think that's a very cogent point, because he was in Haremeier's Hospital, as you know, for about 6 months, and they really did him an awful lot of good.
I remember quite clearly he had quite extensive disease in both lungs, but it was principally his left lung that was affected. But it was very chronic, what we call fibrotic disease, not at all like the classical galloping consumption of the 19th century, which Brontes and the rest of them tended to suffer from. And therefore he was never terribly ill in the sense that he wasn't toxic or fevered or he didn't waste away to any great extent, but he must have felt pretty substandard most of the time. And of course he had a chronic cough, which wasn't helped by the fact that he smoked almost incessantly.
Which was George's room, actually?
Well, when he was ill, which of course was quite often, he worked in the extreme left-hand top room. You can see the window from here. And at other times, when he was feeling well, he worked in the sitting room, which was the extreme right-hand bottom window.
We're in the room in which he wrote 1984. It's a very small room, and I think it was a very overheated and stuffy room. After he came back from Haremeier's, though before going in he'd given up his heavy smoking, he went back on very heavy smoking. He rolled this filthy black shag normally the cheapest kind of navvies tobacco, and he probably smoked about 30 or 40 of those a day while he was working intensely. That's the way the manuscript got written.
He picked up the children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother. The hypnotic eyes gazed into his own. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. And what was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4, or that the force of gravity works, or that the past is unchangeable? If both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arrayed against him. And yet he was in the right. They were wrong and he was right. The obvious, the silly and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard. Water is wet. Objects unsupported fall towards the Earth's centre. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Barn Hill, Isle of Jura, December 1948. Richard is blooming. If he grew up with the ambition of being a farmer, I should be pleased. Of course, that may be the only job left after the atom bombs. If the show does start and is as bad as one fears, it would be fairly easy to be self-supporting on these islands, provided one wasn't looted. In another year or so, I shall have to be thinking about Richard's schooling, but I'm not making any plans because one can't see far ahead now. I'm not going to let him go to a boarding school before he's 10, and I would like him to start off in an elementary school, if one could find a good one. He describes you a lot in his letters. His picture of you is always of somebody happy, healthy, energetic, physically very able, compared with him, because he was very ill when you were a
Oh, indeed, yes.
child.
Yes, he was. I was a picture of health, I think. I had the usual childhood problems of chicken pox and measles, I think, but that was about all.
He's attending the village school, which I think he'll enjoy. He loves farming and boats, and even last year he helped with the farm work to the extent of being quite useful. I shan't influence him if I can help it. But if he does grow up to be a farmer, a sailor, a civil engineer, or something useful of that description, I should be very pleased. Do you remember him ill at all?
I remember him ill when he was actually in hospital, going to visit him there and asking him, what was wrong. Of course, I didn't understand.
The cause of his death was a hemorrhage. A blood vessel in his lung must have ruptured and he bled to death. And that was, in a sense, only indirectly connected with the tuberculosis. I mean, he didn't actually die of consumption in the classical sense. He died of a complication, you might say, a blood vessel which had become eroded, and there was no way of stopping that.
In a way, it was sort of inappropriate, because the poor parson didn't know anything about him, and the service had very little relationship to him, but it was very well attended by every sort of person.
They were very sort of nondescript collection of people, and I don't know, my moment of poignancy actually, for some extraordinary reason, was when the coffin was carried in, because it was so long. It gave one a sort of very feeling of great sadness to see the enormous length of it. It's got to be said that I think on the whole it was an unhappy life. I don't think he was ever, or very rarely, happy.
Winston looked out into the field beyond and underwent a curious, slow shock of recognition. He knew it by sight. An old, close-bitten pasture with a footpath wandering across it, and a molehill here and there. In the ragged hedge on the opposite side, the boughs of the elm trees swayed just perceptibly in the breeze. and their leaves stirred faintly in dense masses, like women's hair. It's the golden country. Almost, he murmured. Nothing, really. A landscape I've seen sometimes in a dream.
The nostalgia for the sort of lost childhood piece of the English Edwardian countryside meant a tremendous amount to him. There was always a sort of golden country, which appeared even in 1984. He has Winston Smith sort of having fragmentary memories of a sort of a golden, innocent youth. And in Coming Up for Air, one sees that explicitly.
All the way down the hill, I was seeing ghosts, the ghosts of hedges and trees and cows. It was as if I was looking at two worlds at once, a kind of thin bubble of the thing that used to be, with the thing that actually existed shining through it. There's the field where the bull chased Ginger Rogers, and there's the place where the horse mushrooms used to grow. I'd come to Lower Binfield with a question in my mind. What's ahead of us? Is the game really up? Can we get back to the life we used to live, or is it gone forever? Well, I had my answer. The old life's finished. And to go about looking for it is just a waste of time. All those years Lower Binfield had been tucked away somewhere or other in my mind, a sort of quiet corner I could step back into when I felt like it. And finally I'd stepped back into it and found that it didn't exist. It doesn't matter how many of them there are, they're all for it. The bad times are coming. What's coming afterwards, I don't know. It hardly even interests me. I only know if there's anything you care a curse about, you better say goodbye to it now. Because everything you've ever known is going down, down into the muck, with the machine guns rattling all the time.
He asked for no memorial service, but he asked that he should be buried, if possible, in a Church of England churchyard. That certainly was quite contradictory with his known beliefs, which were that he didn't have any religious beliefs, but he had this, what you might call sentimental attachment to traditional, habitual things.
I think that was a reversion to his picture of England. It was this tremendous dream that he had of this happy England, of nice open-faced people and sort of beautiful red pillar boxes and countrymen. It was a dream, and the part of that dream was the country churchyard. It was being sort of finishing up where he wanted to be, which is in what he thought was the sort of heart of England, the countryside. But of course, the funny thing about it was one always has this kind of irony built into everything in life. When it came to the point, it was very difficult to get him into a country churchyard. I hadn't realized that till then, that you have to have either live there or have some particular basis for getting in. And in the end, he only got into a country churchyard through the influence of the Astors. So that the thing that he most abominated, in a sense, the sort of millionaires, were needed.
I was only able to do it because I happened to be on friendly terms with the vicar. And in Sutton Courtenay, it's a little village near Abingdon, near Oxford.
When we filmed at the church, there are 2 roses on the...
Oh yeah, well I think he wrote that down. He didn't say that to me. It was written down somewhere. And he wrote the actual words which are on his gravestone, which are the fewest possible. Here lies.
You were an adopted child, and there is conventionally supposed to be some identity discrepancy between adopted children and their father. How do you view your father as your father? Was that ever a problem for you? It often is, isn't it, for adopted children?
I think it probably is. It's never been a problem with me. As far as I was concerned, George Orwell was my father, and that's that.
He wondered again for whom he was writing the diary. For the future, for the past, for an age that might be imaginary. He was a lonely ghost, uttering a truth that nobody would ever hear. But so long as he uttered it in some obscure way, the continuity was not broken. It was not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane that you carried on the human heritage. He went back to the table, dipped his pen, and wrote. To the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists, and what is done cannot be undone. From the age of uniformity, from the age of solitude, from the age of Big Brother, from the age of doublethink, greetings.